Welcome to session 4 of Exile and Empire. This week we are talking about the apocalyptic response to empire. Just as a reminder of the series that we're in, we are talking about how God's people in the past dealt with changing and challenging circumstances and what we can learn from them for dealing with our own changing and challenging world. So we are now in the final session, session 4. Last time we talked about the values of the Roman Empire and how those conflicted with the values that Jesus preached. And some of the ways that this conflict of values led to the persecution of early Christians, particularly in the communities that Paul founded. That's what we focused on in terms of persecution last week. We also saw some of the ways that Paul sought to encourage and strengthen his communities by encouraging them to look at suffering differently and look at family differently and look at the future differently. So that last one, looking at the future differently, is our jumping off point for today's topic. Paul comforted the suffering Christians by assuring them that God will be setting everything right in the future. Elsewhere in the New Testament, we have other examples of this kind of writing about God, what God will do in the future. And these writings, many of these writings are examples of a genre that we call apocalyptic literature. So if you don't know what that is, that's okay, because the first thing that we're going to be doing tonight is asking the question, what is apocalyptic literature? And after that, we will have a brief introduction to the book of Revelation and a little bit of thinking about how we should go about reading that book. And then after that, we'll talk about Revelation as an anti-imperial book. And finally, some themes of Revelation and how they relate to empire before we have a time of discussion at the end. So that's the plan for tonight. So we will jump first into talking about apocalyptic literature in general. In popular use, the word apocalyptic is often used to refer to catastrophic violence and devastation. And we do see some of that in the apocalyptic literature that we have in the Bible. However, the word apocalyptic, as used by biblical scholars, doesn't just refer to catastrophe, but it refers to a particular genre of literature from the ancient world that has some common characteristics. The origins of apocalyptic literature are beginning approximately 200 years before Jesus was born, arising out of Israel's prophetic tradition, but with significant differences from the earlier prophetic tradition. So all of Israel's prophets, the prophets that we read in the Old Testament, had always warned people of punishments and disasters that might fall on them in particular times and places. But apocalyptic literature puts these kind of warnings of disaster in the context of a much larger narrative of the story of the whole world and its future end. The second half of the book of Daniel is apocalyptic and is generally considered to be the only kind of example of a full-blown apocalypse in the Old Testament. The rest of Jewish apocalyptic literature comes primarily from what we call the intertestamental period, and is not in our canon. So chances are most of you are probably not familiar with the majority of Jewish apocalyptic literature because it's not in our Bible. But there are multiple examples of Jewish apocalyptic literature ranging from the first couple centuries before Jesus was born and then into the early part of the Common Era after Jesus's life. So what else can we say about the characteristics of apocalyptic literature? Generally speaking, apocalyptic literature claims to reveal hidden spiritual realities. So the word apocalypse in Greek means a revealing or a disclosure. Also, we can say that apocalyptic literature is generally written in a time of distress and suffering. People don't usually write apocalypses when they think everything is going just fine. That's not the time for apocalypses. This literature is literature that arises out of struggling and suffering communities, and especially those who feel they're being persecuted in some way. We could, in some cases, perhaps go so far as to call it protest literature. It is literature that protests the status quo and the powers that maintain the status quo. In other words, it's literature that sort of expresses the idea that there's something wrong with the way the world is set up and working in the current time period, and it ought to be different, and therefore God is going to do something about that. So related to that, apocalyptic literature sees the powers that control the world as opposed to God and God's people. But however, God is ultimately the one in control, according to the authors of this literature. So even though it seems like evil powers are in control of the world, and those forces, those evil forces, really do have some real power over people, the message of apocalyptic literature is that it is really God who is in control ultimately, and the faithful should persevere because God is going to intervene on their behalf. It also involves visions of heaven and or visions of the future end times. And there's kind of two subcategories of apocalyptic literature. One kind, somebody is sort of has a vision in which they're taken on a tour of heaven, and in the other kind, somebody is given a vision of sort of the coming end of the world and what that's going to be like. Now, these two types can be mixed, as in fact they are in the book of Revelation. So we'll see as we get into Revelation that the author of Revelation has a vision in which he sees the throne room of God in heaven, but also is shown things related to the end of time. These books also often include angelic beings that serve as mediators and guides to the person having the vision. Because people having the people having the visions aren't capable of understanding the meaning of them on their own. So usually they need some angelic help. The last thing to say about apocalyptic literature is that it is packed with symbolism and mysterious figures and events. So generally speaking, readers of apocalyptic literature have a lot of work to do to figure out what the book is referring to and what it's really trying to say. It's not going to be an easy read. um, There are examples of apocalyptic passages in both the Gospels and in Paul's letters, but the most extensive example we have of apocalyptic literature in the New Testament is the book of Revelation. So that's primarily what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we're going to turn now to what is Revelation and how should we read it? First of all, it's really important to note that Revelation is a challenging book. I don't know how many of you have read it before or attempted to read it, but many people find the book challenging. And so if you find it challenging, you can take comfort in the fact that Christians have always found this book challenging, even from the beginning. We have a quote from the great early church theologian Jerome, who wrote in the 4th century, Revelation has as many mysteries as it does words. I like to share this quote because it comes from so long ago, the 4th century. So it's not like the ancient people understood Revelation perfectly, and only more recently have we sort of lost the key. And if we could just find the secret key to unlock it, then we would understand everything. This book has actually always been debated and wrestled with, and we're going to continue that wrestling process this evening. Regarding the title of the book, I said a minute ago that the word apocalypse means a revealing. Another way to say a revealing is a revelation. So the title of Revelation means apocalypse. The title of the book identifies its genre. So it's important to understand the genre of what you're reading in general. If you read a novel as though it's a newspaper, you're going to misunderstand what you're reading. It's usually easy for us to identify the genres of the types of literature that come from our own culture. Like we don't have trouble telling the difference between a novel and a newspaper. But it takes a little more work to understand genres of literature that come from other times and other places. So this is why this is why I wanted to introduce apocalyptic literature in general to you on the previous slide. So now we can try to read Revelation as an apocalypse, not as something else. The authorship of the book, according to, hold on, I think I'm getting behind on my slide here. Yeah. The author of the book, it claims to have been written by someone named John. I think many people assume that this is the Apostle John, but this is probably not a good assumption to make. The book doesn't indicate that it's the Apostle. It only says that the person's name is John, and there were a lot of Johns in the ancient world. Maybe not quite as many as there were Marys, but it was a common name. It's almost certain, at least from the perspective of modern biblical scholars, it's almost certain that this book was not written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of John, which also wasn't necessarily the Apostle John, but that's a story for another day. At any rate, people usually assume that whoever wrote the Gospel of John also wrote Revelation. But these days, that's a very challenged notion. There are a lot of differences in both the language and the style of writing and the theology of the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation. For example, the Gospel of John is the New Testament gospel that is the least focused of the four gospels on the return of Jesus and the end of time, which obviously couldn't be further from the perspective of the book of Revelation, in terms of thinking that that's sort of the most important thing for us to be focusing on. So what's really more important for us to focus on than who wrote the book is actually what's the best way for us to read it. And that's because different ways of reading Revelation lead to very different conclusions about its meaning. This will be a bit of an oversimplification, but sometimes those help. You can kind of put ways of reading Revelation into two big categories or two big approaches that people take to reading the book. The first way we could call futuristic readings. Futuristic readings understand Revelation to be pointing us forward towards things that haven't happened yet. So in this view, your job as the reader is to try to figure out what realities in our own world now or in our world in the future that John was referring to. In other words, futuristic readings think that through divine inspiration, John was writing about things that he couldn't really have known anything about himself, that the symbols in the book stand for things like helicopters or computer chips or, various other things that would be many, many centuries in the future from when he was writing the book. So an example of this kind of reading of Revelation is the Left Behind series of novels, but there are many other examples of it as well. By contrast, there's another way of approaching the book, which we could call a historical reading of the book. This is a reading of Revelation that tries to make sense of its symbols in their own first century context. Historical readings think that John's symbols were pointing towards realities in his own time and place and intended to be a commentary on those realities. So the symbols of the book stand for things in the first century world, the world in which the first readers would have found meaning. So remember how I talked about Revelation being like protest literature that is protesting what's going on in the world. So we may find it more helpful to think about what was going on in the world when the book was written that it may be protesting against than to try to come up with mysterious ideas about what things thousands of years in the future the book may have been referring to. So it is you could probably guess that it'll be more of a historical reading than a futuristic reading that I'm going to be doing this evening. And so because of that, we want to start by thinking about John's context in the first century. And specifically, what historical events happened in the first century that may have led up to Revelation's composition. Like other apocalyptic literature, Revelation was written by someone who was part of a suffering community, and it was written for suffering people. So last week we talked about how and why early Christians were persecuted, and we saw and what we saw about that in Paul's letters. Revelation was written later than Paul's letters, so we could say the situation has only gotten worse since where we left off with it last time. The persecution has become more widespread and serious. I said Revelation was written later than Paul's letters. I should have said in the opinion of most biblical scholars, because there isn't complete agreement about when the book was written. But as you'll see by the time we get to the bottom of this slide that I'm kind of going with the majority opinion these days that the book was probably written in the 90s. So you can kind of keep that in mind as as the time frame. So looking at things that happened sort of after Paul's letters were written, or at least after some of the main bulk of Paul's letters were written that we talked about last week, leading up to the 90s, what was going on. So first of all, we can think about the decade of the 60s and Nero's persecution of Christians. This was the first of two periods in the first century that were particularly difficult for Christians, particularly the late 60s. Some of you may be familiar with the Great Fire in Rome that occurred in the year 64, and that Nero, the Emperor Nero, blamed Christians for it and began executing them. This was the time period in which we believe that some of the great leaders of the first generation of the church were killed, including both Peter and Paul during this time period. Another major event happening shortly after that was the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in the year 70. So this leads Jews and Christians to begin identifying Rome with Babylon, the destroyer of the previous temple. In other words, since Babylon had destroyed the first temple and now Rome had destroyed the second temple, Jews and Christians began referring to Rome with the sort of code name of Babylon. And we do see that being used in Revelation. Fortunately, you guys know all about Babylon already, so you have some historical context for why Jews and Christians may have been inclined to use the code name of Babylon for the Roman Empire during this period. And then we have sort of a quieter period after that, but again, persecution of Christians kind of ramps up again in the period of Domitian's reign in the 90s of the first century. So anti-Christian sentiment seems to have been on the rise again during this period. And this was especially the case in areas where the imperial cult was strong, which I believe that we have talked about previously, the idea that that people were not required maybe, but strongly encouraged to participate in the honoring of the emperor through ritual sacrifices. And this was something that caused Christians to be persecuted when they refused to participate in it. So the worship of Domitian was being heavily promoted, more so than it had been with other emperors in previous decades. And so this led to trouble for Christians who refused to participate in emperor worship, as we talked about last time. The imperial cult was especially strong in the Roman province of Asia, or which is part of the piece of land that we call Asia Minor in the ancient world, or what we call today the nation of Turkey. So in the western part of what is now modern day Turkey was what was called then the Roman province of Asia. And this area was, for whatever reason, just particularly strong in terms of practices related to the imperial cult. So cities in that area like Pergamum and Ephesus would try to outdo each other in showing honor to the Emperor Domitian. So it's not a coincidence that in the book of Revelation, we find that the book is actually addressed to 7 churches in this region, to 7 churches in the region of Asia Minor, in the Roman province of Asia. So it was really not a good time to be a Christian in Asia who refused to participate in emperor worship. So in Revelation chapter 2, verse 13, we have reference to the death of someone named Antipas who had died for his faith. So we have sort of martyrdom sort of beginning in this time period and in this particular area of the empire. So as I said earlier, most scholars think that Revelation was written during this time while the church was experiencing the persecution of the 90s and probably still also remembered the trauma of the 60s. So that we know something about the trauma of the 60s, right? We can remember that. That was their 60s. We had a different 60s. But so there's one more aspect of Revelation's historical setting that I want to mention, though, and that is the fact that the author of this book says that he is writing the book while in exile on the island of Patmos. Now, of course, he's just one person, but he happens to be the author of the book, and he himself is experiencing a distressing situation. So perhaps all of these factors combined, we aren't so surprised to find that John and others felt that the world was surely coming to an end soon. So the next thing we want to think about is, what purpose does the book serve as apocalyptic literature in this context? And I would say that the purpose of Revelation in this context is to offer readers a way to view the world, a new point of view, like we've talked about in this series of classes already before. So a new way to view the world and a basis for hope in a time of crisis. So we don't have time to go into detail about, the contents of the entire book of Revelation, but I do want to give us just a quick overview of the book so that we have a sense for generally what's in this book before we talk about the anti-imperial aspects of it. So the vision that John has begins in chapter 1. We have some greetings, some explanations, and the first appearance of Jesus in exalted form, like the way that Jesus looks in this vision that John is having is described in chapter 1. Then in chapters 2 and 3, we have letters to the 7 churches. As I said earlier, these are 7 churches that were located in Asia Minor. Each of them is either commended or reprimanded based on how faithfully they have endured or whether they have slacked off in their devotion to the truth and followed false teachers. So we want to remember the challenges that I've identified that these churches were enduring, that they were living in the midst of a heavily promoted imperial cult. They are going to suffer if they remain faithful to God alone. But John is holding them to a high standard. So he's not letting them off the hook when he thinks that they have not been behaving properly or keeping themselves to the right worship of God alone. John's not big on compromise. So if he feels they have compromised, then they really get reprimanded. In chapters 4 and 5, we have a vision of the throne room of God. So John is taken to heaven where he observes unceasing worship around the throne of God. And then for the bulk of the middle part of the book, we have a series of cycles of 7. The book is very cyclical in nature. So the number 7 is often understood to be a number of completeness in the Bible. And so that's probably why it's 7 of each. So all the consequences that happen as a result of each of these things are portrayed as being sort of as complete as they can be. So the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls are all somewhat similar to each other in the sense that when a seal is opened or a trumpet is blown or a bowl is poured out in heaven, this results in all kinds of violence and plagues and catastrophes on the earth. The signs are a little different. These are a variety of kinds of things that John sees, such as a woman clothed with the sun who gives birth to the Messiah, and the angel Michael leading the forces of heaven in battle against a dragon. After all of that, we have the fall of Babylon and the triumph of God. So we have the defeat of God's enemies in chapter 17 through 20. The whore of Babylon, the beast, and the dragon, who I'm going to talk about more in a minute. We also then have the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment. This is followed by chapters 21 and 22, in which we have a new heaven and a new earth. So this is the good news part of the book, that God will now dwell with God's people and there will be no more suffering. There is a river to water the tree of life. And so at the very end of the Bible, at least the Bible as we've set it up as Christians, at the very end of the Bible, we've come full circle. Genesis begins with Eden. And at the end of Revelation, we have, in a sense, an image of Eden reborn. So that's an overview of the whole thing. What we're going to focus on now is, in particular, the anti-imperial aspects of the book. So among those who read Revelation with a historical approach, there is a strong consensus that the book is primarily providing commentary on the Roman Empire, which it sees as a force of evil in the world, and believes that God will destroy it in the future when Jesus returns. So the book condemns Rome for 3 things, at least 3 things, 3 main things. So the sins of Rome are, first of all, idolatry in the form of both paganism and emperor worship. So the worship of gods and goddesses in sort of the Greco-Roman pantheon, as well as the imperial cult that I've been talking about previously. Second is the persecution and killing of God's people. So Christians, in other words, Christians are being persecuted by the Roman Empire. So that's another reason that the book views it as an evil force in the world. And then thirdly, the sumptuous lifestyles of its powerful leaders that oppress the poor. So there are three, so those are three sins of Rome. There are also three symbols in Revelation that are particularly important for understanding this critique of Rome, the dragon, the beast, and the whore. So this is the way that most readers today, taking a scholarly historical approach to the book, look at these symbols. Most people think that the dragon represents Satan, the beast represents the Roman Empire, and the whore of Babylon represents the city of Rome itself as the capital of the empire. So if we understand the book in this way, if we read these symbols in this way, some very specific critiques of Rome emerge from the text. So we're going to look at each of these important symbols in turn. Well, the dragon and the beast together, actually. So for instance, in terms of the critiques of Rome that emerge when you understand the book in this way, we see in chapter 13 that when the beast is introduced, we learn that it gets its power from the dragon. And I'll just remind you quickly, since it's not on the screen anymore, the beast is representing the Roman Empire and the dragon, Satan. So beginning at the start of chapter 13, it says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its head were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power and his throne and great authority." So again, the dragon is Satan and the beast is the Roman Empire. So that means that if the beast is getting its power from the dragon, then what John is really saying here is that Satan is the power behind the Roman Empire. So that's quite a claim. That's quite a claim to make, right, in that context. It goes on from there to say that they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" So these verses say that people are worshiping both the dragon and the beast. I think this is a commentary both on paganism and the imperial cult. John is interpreting the worship of false gods as worship of Satan, and also condemning the imperial cult, those who worship the empire in the form of honoring the emperor through worship rituals. And it goes on, and it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. So in addition to false worship, the beast is also making war on the saints, that is, persecuting Christians for their faith. And as empires do, it is conquering every tribe and nation, subduing all the earth, right? Because as we've talked about before, that's what empires do. They use their power to conquer other peoples and nations. The third figure that I wanted to talk about is the whore of Babylon, who seems to represent the city of Rome, while the beast represents the whole empire. Chapter 17, verse 18, identifies her as the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. It's very common in the Bible for cities to be personified as female figures, so it's not surprising here that the city of Rome would be represented in the book by the figure of a woman. So she's described at the beginning of chapter 17. It says, "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, and with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk.' So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly amazed. So here we have a really nice picture. Well, not a nice picture, but you know what I mean. A clear picture of Rome's sins. So remember the 3 sins of Rome I talked about earlier. It was idolatry, persecution of the faithful, and the sumptuous lifestyles of the rich that oppress the poor. So we have all 3 of those illustrated here in this passage about describing the whore of Babylon. So in terms of idolatry, she's described as being seated on the beast that has blasphemous names, the one that people are worshiping. So she's sitting on the false beast that represents the imperial cult. In terms of persecution of the faithful, it says that she's drunk on the blood of the saints. So she's got this cup in her hand, and what she's drinking is the blood of, Jesus followers, basically. And then finally, sumptuous lifestyles and oppression of the poor. She's portrayed as being dressed in exceedingly expensive clothing and jewelry. We also see here in this passage that she's given the name Babylon. So that relates to what I said earlier about there being a connection between Babylon and Rome, because both were destroyers of Jerusalem and of the temple. After this passage that I read to you, we see the downfall and destruction of the whore described in graphic and frankly very disturbing imagery. I'm not going to read all of that to you, but that occurs. And then only the kings and the merchants mourn for her at her downfall. So they're the ones who had loved her and benefited from her. In other words, those are the people who are benefiting from the empire, the ruling elite and the merchants. They like the empire. Everybody else is not too happy about it. So that's how some of the big symbols of the book of Revelation relate to the Roman Empire. I also want to talk about some general themes in the book of Revelation and how they also relate to the empire. So how does the book of Revelation help persecuted, suffering Christians in the first century? I'm going to go through some of these themes that relate to what readers are meant to get from the book in terms of this context that they're living in and how this book might help them sort of cope with the situation of persecution and suffering that they're experiencing. So perhaps the number one most important central theme in the book of Revelation is worship of the one true God alone. So no one but God alone is worthy of worship. All other things that we might give our allegiance to need to be given a secondary status. Our ultimate allegiance should be to God alone. Just one small example of the extensive worship language in Revelation is Revelation 4:11. You are worthy, our Lord God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. A lot of the worship language that we're familiar with from the liturgy and hymns of our church come from the book of Revelation. So you're reading through this book with all these horrible, disturbing, graphic images of violence, and all of a sudden this familiar hymn that you've sung a million times will just pop up to surprise you. So this is the primary message for those first century Christians. Worship God alone, not the Greco-Roman gods and not the emperor. But as we've already seen, if they do this, they're in for trouble, which is why another message of Revelation is the patient endurance of the faithful. So here is a call for the endurance of the saints, for those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. The primary thing for persecuted saints, when I say saints, I mean believers, the primary thing for persecuted believers to do is to hold on, stand firm and wait for God's vindication. Don't fall away because of persecution. It is God and the angels who fight. So Christians are not told to fight, but to wait with patient endurance. The other thing that saints do, besides just sitting around and enduring, is witness. So they testify to the truth. In Greek, the word witness is martus, where we get the English word martyr from. So martyrs are witnesses. This is the word that's used to describe those whose blood the whore was drinking. So that's from the passage I read earlier. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. The next one is Christ and the nature of authentic power. So as strange as it seems, we do find support in this very violent book for a life of nonviolence. Graphic images of horrible violence fill the book, and I'm not trying to downplay that at all. If you've never read it before and you go read it after this class, you're going to be very disturbed. There are graphic, horrible images of violence throughout the whole book. But all of this violence, if you read it very carefully, you notice that all of this violence happens in sort of heavily symbolic narratives, or even in the spiritual realm, like wars are happening in heaven, for example. As I said a minute ago, never are the saints on earth instructed to literally take up arms against their enemies. The primary image for Jesus in the book is the image of the slaughtered lamb. And the primary way that Jesus wins victory is through his own blood. So the great irony of the book is the one with true power is the slaughtered lamb, not the seemingly powerful Roman army with a Roman emperor with his great army. So the lamb conquers the great beast. How does the lamb conquer the beast? The lamb conquers the beast by dying. So we have, I don't think I'll read these, but I do just have on, if you wanted to take note of those references to read them later, you could, just some descriptions of the lamb, how the lamb is described in particularly in Revelation chapter 5. The next one is judgment and salvation. So in Revelation, God clearly judges sin, especially the sins of idolatry and oppression of others. And yet for readers who are believers, because we would think that this book is aimed at people who are in the church already, right? It's not an evangelism tool. Although people do in the modern world try to use it that way, but I would propose that that was not its original intent. It was originally a message for the insiders of the church, right? So for the first readers who are believers, Revelation offers not really a threat of judgment, but actually a promise of salvation. And not just an individual salvation, like, how I know that I'm going to be okay personally, but actually a new creation salvation in which God will renew the whole world and provide for God's people a place of safety and abundance, where there will be no more war, no more dying, and no more tears. So here's the promise at the end of the book in Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." So through everything that I've said so far tonight about the themes of Revelation runs this final theme, which is the difference between appearance and reality. So it may look like Rome is currently in control, but Revelation tells its readers that Rome's days are numbered because God has judged it, and God is the one who is really in control. So the power of Rome is an illusory power. The faithful can live with the ultimate trust that God is there and God is in control and God will make all things new. So in just a moment, I'm going to pause the recording, but I'm going to go through first the questions that I want us to talk about in response to all of this. First is, what are your reactions to the book of Revelation and what I've said about it tonight? Second, in what ways does a historical reading of Revelation help us to understand how the first century church dealt with its struggles? Bringing it home to ourselves a little bit more, we could ask, what do we worship other than God? You know, so I put worship in quotation marks because I'm assuming none of you have been down the street to the Temple of Zeus anytime recently. But we can talk a little bit more symbolically about what are the things that we maybe worship through our lifestyles, right, other than God, and how do these things exert an imperial control over us. We started talking last week about what forces of empire we see in the world today. And so I kind of want to continue that conversation tonight and see if anything that I've said about a Revelation gives you any new ideas about that question, especially in terms of what we worship. And then the last one is, what is New Hope's role in shaping an alternative to empire for its members and for the larger community? How do we already do that, and how might we do that more? And that was the homework I gave you from last time to be thinking about for our conversation tonight. So we'll have some conversation about all four of these questions now. So I just want to end with a very quick summary of all four sessions that we had. Which was session 1. We talked about how our stories and our identity are shaped by our experiences. Session 2, we talked about broadening our perspectives through encounters with those who are different from us. Session 3, seeking to live Jesus's values and have God's point of view while suffering. And then finally, tonight was remaining faithful to God in the midst of empire. So this final discussion question, just to leave you with, is what further thoughts do you have about New Hope's current context and future direction based on this 4-session study of exile and empire?